He was known as the architect of the Holocaust. 60 years ago, the notorious Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann stood trial, charged with unimaginable crimes against humanity, the murder of millions of people. People around the world watched as survivors recounted the horrors Eichmann set in motion, the mass murder of Jews and others in Nazi concentration camps. I want to bring in CNN senior legal analyst Elie Honig. Elie, you are the grandson of two Holocaust survivors. This is a very personal story for you. You spoke to a prosecutor and an investigator from the trial of Eichmann. Tell us about that. It's just a remarkable story.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, so two of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, lost most of their families, really my family, to the Nazi genocide. So this has always been personal and a passion for me. I had this remarkable opportunity to sit down and interview two of the key players, both in their mid-90s, from the Eichmann trial. These men, as you'll see in a moment, are truly living history. I think their message is so important for history, and even now it resonates. So let's take a look. 60 years ago, the world saw evil. In 1961, millions of people across the globe watched as Adolf Eichmann, the notorious Nazi official known as the architect of the Holocaust, stood trial in Jerusalem for crimes against humanity. 11 months earlier, Israeli Mossad agents had captured Eichmann in Argentina, where he'd been living as a fugitive for a decade. They brought Eichmann to Jerusalem to face justice for his role in the systematic execution of more than 6 million Jews during World War II.
Your grandma is here. She's the fourth from the right.
Right. So the vast majority of the people in this picture did not make it.
Did not survive.
My father, the son of two Holocaust survivors, remembers the trial as a turning point.
You have to understand, now everyone knows the Holocaust with a capital H. Right. When we grew up, this was not a thing. The Holocaust was not a thing. Mm-hmm. It was a private tragedy. It was a tragedy of the Jewish people. So a lot of it wasn't spoken about until Eichmann.
The accused, together with others, during the period 1939 to 1945, caused the killing of millions of Jews in his capacity as the person responsible for the execution of the Nazi plan for the physical extermination of the Jews, known as the Final Solution.
Gabriel Bach, now 94 years old, was one of the prosecutors who tried Eichmann in Israel's newly formed court system.
This was really a very, very special moment that here in a Jewish state, in a Jewish trial, we are the representatives of the Jewish people. And that we can show that the man who murdered millions of people of our society, that was very, very justifiable and very just, that we should do that and not leave it to a court of another country.
It was one of the first televised trials the world had ever seen, and it was a pivotal moment in the world's reckoning with the genocide perpetrated by the Nazis.
I was about 17 when the Nazis took over. In July 1942, my parents and my sister were taken onto a train. We did not know where at the time, but later found out it was the Belzec extermination camp. My sister was 10 years old. The last time I saw them was on my birthday. It was July 26, 1942, and I saw them for 15 minutes.
Like my grandmother, Michael Goldman Gilad, now 96 years old, lost most of his family to the Holocaust. He survived the horrors of multiple concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and he survived the infamous Death March. Little did Goldman Gilad know he would go on to play a pivotal role as an investigator in the trial of Adolf Eichmann.
I was in my investigation room, and when he entered the room, I saw a poor, frightened person shaking. And in comparison to Eichmann in his SS uniform, this Ubermensch, I couldn't believe it. It was the same person standing in front of me, responsible for the death of my parents. But when he opened his mouth, I cannot forget this. When he opened his mouth, I saw the doors of the crematorium open.
After months of the prosecution presenting its case, Eichmann finally took the stand in his own defense.
Ob sie nun getötet wurden oder nicht, musste durchgeführt werden.
Under cross-examination, despite being confronted with documents that showed his direct involvement, Eichmann repeatedly claimed he was just following orders.
Und dann erst zum Befehlsempfänger kommen.
I am not beating about the bush. I was in Hungary also one of those receiving orders and not giving orders.
He lied through and through. He was acting. He was acting all the time.
In September 1939, the accused committed acts of expelling, uprooting, and exterminating the population in coordination with massacres.
Finally, in December 1961, the trial was over and the verdict was in. The court found Eichmann guilty and sentenced him to death.
Here was a man who was appointed to be in charge of causing the carrying out of the murder of millions of people. So if any person deserves it, it was him.
After Eichmann had exhausted all of his legal appeals, he was hanged just a few minutes past midnight on June 1st, 1962. 60 years later, with the number of living witnesses to the Nazi campaign of terror shrinking by the day, the risk of Holocaust distortion and denial is a threat that makes the lessons of the Eichmann trial more relevant today than ever.
Jews will not replace us!
The fight against hate based on race, religion, ethnicity, sex is a battle that's still being fought. White supremacy and racial hatred remain serious threats, and they're on the rise.
With the death of Eichmann, the murderous ideology of nationalist socialism was not scattered. It is still existing here and there in the form of hatred. Hatred that is dangerous. And we must be on guard so that catastrophes do not repeat themselves. Hatred can cause catastrophes and bring an end to this world, to this planet. And we must educate the new generations not to hate and to avoid such hatred. Otherwise, our struggle against evil will be in vain.
As the grandson of two Holocaust survivors, I am part of one of those new generations. 60 years ago, Gabriel Bach and Michael Goldman-Gilad stood up and fought for justice, for their own families, for mine, and for millions of others. Both of these men truly are living history, and they stood for justice 60 years ago, and I think they still stand for justice today.
Yeah, Elie, I mean, these stories are so important because, you know, we can't forget what happened. And we can't forget that there was this remarkable trial that took place. I mean, and their place in that trial and your family's place in this larger story. But I want to ask you about something else that has come up in recent days. I'm sure you've seen this. You did this piece before the audio came out of a school administrator in Texas saying classroom libraries should include, quote, opposing views of the Holocaust. I mean, that is the perfect example of why documentaries like yours should be shown to the public, because people are forgetting these lessons of the past.
Yeah, Jim, and both of these men stressed to me that they feel it's so important that people remember those lessons and take them into the future. And, you know, there is a rising tide of Holocaust denialism. Polls show that somewhere between a quarter and half the people think the Holocaust was fabricated or a myth. And I'll tell you, Michael Goldman, the 96-year-old investigator you see in that piece, he still has his Auschwitz tattoo, his prisoner number tattoo. He showed it to us in the longer version on his forearm. So anyone who questions whether this was real, I would ask you to watch the full version of this piece. It's as real as that tattoo on Michael Goldman's forearm.
Well, anybody who questions that, I mean, they should have their head examined, first of all. But second of all, thank you, Elie, so much. Not only for what you do every week for us on this show, but for doing this documentary, putting this together, and your family's contribution to it, and to the larger story that has to be told, has to be ingrained in our younger generation so they don't forget the past.
Thanks, Jim.
All right, thank you, Elie. We appreciate it. And now here.